I'm going to talk a little bit about Arctic sea ice cover change. And I want to point out that a lot of this work has been done by my collaborators, in addition to myself, including Mike Steele, Gov Peng, and Walt Meyer, both of which are here, and then also Suzanne Dickinson. And I think I was invited to give this talk to this particular group, the ecosystem group, because sea ice is known as a driver of ecosystem change. So where we have very rapid decline in Arctic sea ice extent, we're also getting very rapid change in the Arctic ecosystem, both on land and in the ocean, through a variety of direct and indirect pathways. And as you can see from the figure on the left from Post and others, I think this kind of nicely summarizes a lot of the processes that are reliant on sea ice. And Post makes the point that sea ice is unique in that it has the seasonal cycle where it's present for some parts of the year, but it also retreats annually. And if we're getting a case where that sea ice is retreating sooner and further away from the coastlines, it's lengthening this annual period that the ecosystem does not have that sea ice platform to work with. So Arctic sea ice decline, we've known or studied quite a bit about this, especially using the passive microwave satellite record. So in the plot on the left from NSIDC, what you see is the monthly September sea ice extent for the Arctic since 1979. And it's pretty clear that we've had a dramatic decline in the summer sea ice extent, decreasing at a rate of about 13.2% per decade. But the annual Arctic sea ice extent minimum is really just one key indicator of Arctic climate change. We can also look at the extent of sea ice in the winter season when Arctic sea ice is very near its annual maxima extent, and we're also getting significant declines in the winter as well. So for February, the average monthly sea ice extent has been decreasing at a rate of about 3.1% per decade. So we have these two indicators of Arctic climate change, the sea ice minima and also the sea ice maximum. But as we all know, sea ice has a seasonal cycle. Every year it retreats during the summer and then it grows back in the wintertime. So in between these two key events, the max and the minimum, there's a lot that happens in between. So what we want to do here is really examine how the seasonal cycle and the sea ice is changing throughout time. And the way we're doing this is using satellite passive microwave sea ice concentration data. And what we're doing is deriving a set of sea ice cover indicators where we identify the dates of significant changes in the sea ice concentration for a particular location. So as you can see in this diagram on the right side, what we're looking at is an idealized view of how the sea ice concentration changes over the season. And as the sea ice concentration threshold changes as sea ice decreases during the summer months and increases over the winter growth season, we can identify key dates within that period. So what we're doing is identifying the dates of sea ice opening, which we define as when the sea ice concentration drops below 80%. The 80% concentration threshold is what's usually used to define the extent of the marginal ice zone. So everywhere where sea ice is 80% or less within your area. We're also identifying the dates of sea ice retreat, which is where the sea ice concentration drops below 15%. At that point, we consider our location as having complete open ocean. On the growth side, after the annual sea ice extent minimum, we can also identify the dates of sea ice advance when the sea ice concentration increases above 15% again, and finally the dates of sea ice closing when the sea ice concentration increases above 80%. So we define for the Arctic at each grid cell location what day of the year that our sea ice opens, retreats, advances, and closes. Now, once we have these dates, we can also define the periods of time between particular pairs of dates. So for example, during the sea ice loss period, when the sea ice retreats back, we can define what's called the slip, or the seasonal loss of ice period. And that's just the length of time it takes for the sea ice to change from the date of opening to the date of retreat. For the growth season, we can do the same thing and define something called the SGIP, or the seasonal growth of ice period, which defines the amount of time it takes for the ice to increase from 15% concentration to 80% concentration. Using these dates, we can also define the length of the melt season, or the outer ice-free period. So when the sea ice is below 80% during the year, and also the inner ice-free period, which is equivalent to our open water period. So from these dates and these periods, we can start to describe how the sea ice changes throughout the year using just the passive microwave sea ice concentrations. We can also include other passive microwave data to help define more important timing in sea ice change, including things like melt onset dates and freeze onset dates, which are also derived from passive microwave satellite data. So these provide us a full set of climate indicators that describe sea ice change throughout the entire ice season. So what does this look like on the regional scale? These figures both are throwing a whole lot of data at you. So if we just focus on the left-hand side, this figure summarizes the seasonal Arctic change in sea ice for every year from 1979 through 2016. So the curves here represent various dates of melt onset that we get from passive microwave data. The curves here in the middle with the triangles indicate freeze onset dates. So for each row in this figure, it summarizes a year of sea ice change. So the important thing to note in this figure is that in these light blue bars, what you're seeing is the length of the slip period. So the amount of time in the year it takes for the sea ice concentration to drop from 80% at our date of opening to 15% at our date of sea ice retreat. So the dark blue bars, that length of time corresponds to our open water period for this region. And conversely, when the sea ice grows back at the end of the melt season, noted by these light gray colored bars, that's the corresponding growth period. So between our date of sea ice advance and date of sea ice closing, so when that sea ice grows back. And the takeaway here is that if you look at the changes in the sea ice season for the Arctic region, there's some variability, but on the larger scale, there's not a whole lot of apparent change that you can see from a figure like this. But if we break it down regionally or even locally, we see a lot more variability in these particular dates. So our indicators, as you can see on the right-hand side in the Beaufort Sea, year to year, there can be quite a bit of change in when these particular sea ice changes happen. So to back out a bit and just kind of summarize what these dates and periods look like for the Arctic as a whole, here what I'm showing are maps showing the mean dates and period lengths over the full satellite record. So these are for years 1979 through 2016. In the top row, what you can see are our dates of sea ice opening, retreat, advance, and closing. And what you should notice from these figures is that the average overall date of opening for the Arctic is roughly in mid-June, date of retreat in mid-July, advance in early November, and closing in mid-November. But what you notice is that there's a lot of gradients across the sea ice. So depending on where you're located, you can have quite a bit of difference in when these particular events happen. So for example, here in sort of the Chukchi region, the mean date of retreat tends to occur sometime in August. But out here in the Bering Sea, your typical date of retreat occurs in May. So depending on where you're located in the Arctic, the sea ice seasonal cycle looks pretty different. If we go down to the bottom row, here are the left two plots. We have the seasonal loss of ice period and our seasonal gain of ice period. And what you can see is that Arctic-wide, the loss period tends to take about 26 days, while the corresponding growth period tends to take about 15 days. So in general, the loss period takes a much longer amount of time to happen than the corresponding growth period. And if we look at the open water period, again, we have quite a bit of spatial variability, but the average open water period is roughly 118 days. And the outer ice-free period, which corresponds roughly to the length of our full melt season, is about 157 days. But again, that varies latitude only. So the picture becomes pretty clear when we look at decadal trends over this time period. So from 1979 to 2016, we can look at our dates and periods and see pretty clearly that there's some dramatic changes that have been occurring for most of the Arctic. For example, the dates of opening and dates of retreat are generally occurring about 5 days per decade earlier in the year. So sea ice is retreating sooner. On the right side, you can see that our dates of advance and dates of closing pretty uniformly across most of the Arctic are occurring later in the year by more than 5 days per decade. Our corresponding slip and SGIP periods, so the sea ice loss periods and sea ice growth periods, do not have as strong of a signal Arctic-wide, but you can see pockets where there is some change in how long those particular periods are. And we do get statistically significant small negative trends indicating that those two periods are shortening over the satellite record. So given that date of opening and retreat is occurring early in the year and date of advance and closing is occurring later in the year, what we get, of course, is very strong positive trends in the length of the open water period and our outer ice-free period, or the length of the melt season. So Arctic-wide, the average trend in the length of the open water period is increasing at a rate of about 12 days per decade. Same thing, about 12 days per decade for the lengthening of the melt season. But what you can notice is that locally, you can have trends, for example, here in the Barents Sea and Kara Sea regions, that are locally larger than 30 days per decade. And I want to note that these trends are represented as days per decade, considering that what I'm showing here is 38 years of sea ice data. That's nearly 4 decades. Arctic-wide, what that means is that the sea ice, or the open water period, has been lengthening by about 48 days since 1979. So we're getting pretty significant changes in sea ice cover throughout the entire sea ice season. And to change gears a little bit, one thing we were able to do with our climate indicators, particularly the dates of retreat, is to look into how the seasonal ice zone extent is changing over our satellite record. So for example, the two maps on the left just compare 2 years of the seasonal ice zone extent, shown in dark blue. The light blue colors show you the surviving sea ice at the end of the melt season for that year. These 2 years were very extreme years in terms of the size of the seasonal ice zone. 1996 is the lowest seasonal ice zone extent, nearly 8 million kilometers squared. 2012 is, of course, the record largest, currently holds the record for the lowest sea ice extent minima. That's also our largest year with the greatest seasonal ice zone extent. So we derive the seasonal ice zone by taking the extent of sea ice between the March maximum sea ice extent and areas where sea ice retreats during the year. So it's the difference between the sea ice maximum and the sea ice minimum. And if we look at how the seasonal ice zone is changing regionally, we get sort of three different categories of how the sea ice is responding in particular locations around the Arctic. So here on the right-hand side, you can see in these panels, we've broken up trends in the seasonal ice zone extent for various regions around the Arctic. So the black curves with the red trend lines are showing you the trend in the seasonal ice zone extent for that particular region. The blue curves are showing the extent or the maximum extent of sea ice within that region at the March max. So the gray areas in between these two curves represent the amount of sea ice that survived the summer melt season. So in some regions, we have areas where the sea ice retreats completely every year. So for example, here in the Baffin Bay, these two curves almost always coincide. So the sea ice that grows during the winter melts back completely during the summertime. So this region, for example, in the Baffin Bay, is seasonally ice-free nearly every year. We also have some regions that are sort of open to the southern seas, including the Greenland Sea and the Barents Sea. And these regions, when we look at the seasonal ice zone change over time, we see that the extent of the seasonal ice zone is really driven by that decline in winter maximum sea ice extent. So if you have less sea ice extent growing in the winter, there's less sea ice area available to be melted that following summer. But for most of the central Arctic, in the winter, the area is fully sea ice covered. So for these regions here, like the Kara and Laptev Sea, every year the maximum sea ice extent is the same because that region is fully sea ice covered in the winter. But if we look at the trends in the seasonal ice zone extent over time, we see that we have these positive trends, meaning that every year the sea ice is retreating further and further. The seasonal ice zone is growing in these particular regions. So it's important to note the difference in how a particular region, the ice is going to impact the local environment in that area. If we were to extrapolate these trend lines for the seasonal ice zone extent and the winter maximum sea ice extent, regions such as the Kara Sea and the Chukchi Sea are sort of next in line to become seasonally ice-free, similar to the Baffin Bay. So we have a lot of change happening in the sea ice cover, both Arctic-wide, but also regionally, the signal can be very different. So to kind of summarize this, there's a lot of spatial variability in our climate indicators across the Arctic. So depending on what your area of interest is, the pattern in these changes could look quite different. Our dates of sea ice opening and retreat are generally occurring earlier, Arctic-wide, at about 5 days per decade. The same with sea ice advance and closing. Those are occurring later, again, about 5 days per decade. And the result of those two changes are that the open water period is definitely lengthening by about 12 days per decade. But locally, that change can be as large as 30 days or more. And we also find that the seasonal ice zone for now is growing for most of the Arctic. But if we find that Arctic winter sea ice extents are reduced further, eventually that will change. And the seasonal ice zone extent will begin to decrease since there's less ice available to be melted throughout the year. So the take-home message here really is that we have these observed changes in sea ice cover that have major implications for the Arctic surface energy balance and also the Arctic ecosystem. but we're getting these changes that are occurring at all points throughout the seasonal sea ice cycle. So we can begin to look at in more detail how the sea ice is changing throughout the year and not just focus on a couple of indicators. We can sort of build back that picture throughout the sea ice seasonal cycle. So with that, thanks. I'll take any questions. I do want to mention that if you'd like to read more, yesterday, Peng had a paper that was published that we worked on that describes the Arctic-wide regional variability of our climate indicators. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela. That was a superb presentation. Are there any questions for Angela?
I've got one. This is Will. What's the you did a bunch of regions. What's the smallest scale region that you're doing? For example, if I was interested in the area just north of Svalbard, do you go down to that resolution, or north of Greenland, for example?
Our regions are fairly large. So on like the sea scale, so the Beaufort Sea or the Bering Sea, but our data sets are gridded. The data resolution is nominally 25 kilometers. Right. So we have these data. So if you have a particular area of interest, we can definitely break it down and do a more local study of sort of what's happening. So there's a lot of ways that we could do this, but at this point, our regions are fairly large.
How hard is it to break that down? I mean, is that something that, a civilian could do? Or, I mean, how much effort goes into that?
It's fairly easy. What we've done is basically produced a data set that for every year of data, we just have like a netcdf file with different layers for each of our dates. So the date of opening, date of retreat, advance, and so forth. So it could be as simple as somebody drawing a domain and then calculating the mean within that area. So we're interested to hear if there's particular, areas of interest that you would like to see or collaborate with or share the data. We'd love to do that and kind of, find more ways to use this data set in a way that's meaningful to other communities. So.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I talk? Hello? Hi. I joined late, sorry. To address that question, I mean, as Angela said, we love to collaborate with people and try to come up with different ways to use these data, write a paper or whatever. But we also are funded to create a data set that's going to live at NSIDC, right, Walt? And so when you say, can the public play with the data, that is definitely the hope. So.
Yeah, this is Walt. We are planning to have the data at NSIDC, and it's based off the NOAA NSIDC climate data record. So the raw input data is available. So in theory, someone could drive it on themselves, but we'll hopefully save folks a lot of time and effort by providing that.
Hi, this is Warren Hurwitz from Alaska region. So I'm pretty interested in ice up here, and one of the curious things that happened this year, I'm sure you're aware of, is that we had like a minimum in the Bering Sea, as you probably know about, but we also had a lot of ice in the Beaufort Sea, a lot of old ice. Are you looking at different stages of ice in your analysis at all? Because that seems to be pretty important, what sticks around and what doesn't, what melts and what doesn't. And
at the moment, we don't, but we are beginning to dig into the data more and pull in information, whether it's multi-year ice fraction or, first year ice. to look at those. I'm also interested in bringing in melt pond data potentially to kind of see, further break it down to see how the ice evolves through time. So it's definitely something that we're starting to look into now. But at this point, we've sort of developed the data and done the basic background statistics on that. But it's definitely something that we're planning to look into.
Yeah, 'cause it seems to be there's a lot of different impacts or actually forces that are global climate forces that are causing a lot of these changes. And some of them, like in the Bear Area, are probably being impacted by those storms from the lower middle latitudes that are driving the open water. And then in the Beaufort, there's a total different set of forces that are causing the ice concentration there, especially this year. So it's a very complex system. And I think it's real important to kind of look at global patterns and how global patterns are impacting upper latitude ice conditions, because that seems to be a major factor.
Yeah, I agree. There's definitely a lot more work that can be done to look into these particular changes, and it's something that we want to do in the future.
Any other questions for Angela? Angela, thank you again.
Thank you.
That was a great presentation, great answers also.